This is Repulse Bay, Northwest Territory, Canada, on the Arctic Circle. 5,200 miles almost due south of Repulse Bay lies New Orleans, Louisiana, USA, on the Gulf Coast. This is the route traveled by one of the most unique adventures recorded in North American history. An expedition from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico by canoe. On May 27, 1970, the Shield canoe expedition left Repulse Bay by canoe. On October 7th, they arrived in New Orleans weary, bedraggled, but triumphant. This is the story of what happened in the 4 months and 11 days between. The expedition was fathered, financed, and fought for by Mr. Vern Schield, retired Iowa businessman. Barry Lane was chief of the latter-day voyagers and the one man who made the entire trip by canoe. Gentlemen, before we look at the films of your adventure, I think a word of explanation might very well be in order here. Wasn't this a most unusual trip to have made? I mean, particularly in this day of jumbo jets and speeds of hundreds of miles an hour.
Maybe so, but this is a trip that I've been wanting to make ever since I was a boy. Love for adventure, I guess. This is a route we traveled from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico in a canoe, through the middle of Canada and United States, and walk less than 1 mile. More miles will be traveled up south than down south. 200 miles south of the Canadian border, the water flows north. The past 25 years, I've traveled extensively in Canada, the second largest country in the world. And I contend that more water flows north on the North American continent than south. This continental divide runs east and west across North America. The water that falls on the north side flows down north. The water on the south side flows down south. The rain that falls in southern Lake Michigan flows nearly 600 miles north to the Atlantic Ocean. Here at Browns Valley, Minnesota, we reached our highest elevation on the entire 5,200-mile voyage, 1,140 feet. Anyone traveling from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico between New York and San Francisco and stay under 1,200 feet elevation would have to be going through Browns Valley, Minnesota. After spending 6 weeks on the treacherous waters of Hudson Bay, we headed up the Hayes River, the route of the old voyagers, and it's 132 portages to Lake Winnipeg. Still traveling up south, 200 miles south of the Canadian border, we have coined this phrase, it's uphill most of the way down. Right, Barry?
Right. We were grateful to reach the point where we were at last going with the current. That was Browns Valley, Minnesota. There we had to carry the canoe 3/4 of a mile.
Speaking of canoes, let's look at yours.
The canoe is built along the same line as the birch bark canoe used by the Hudson Bay voyageurs. However, little Eric, it's made out of fiberglass. It's a little tougher and more resilient than the birch bark was. We still had to patch it several times along the trail, however.
Why the name Little Eric?
That's for Leif Erikson, the first man to explore North America.
Now, wait a minute. We're not going to open that argument here. That's Eskimo words at the other end of the canoe, right?
We sort of used the polar bear as a symbol for the expedition, and the symbols underneath it stand for Pola Nanuk, or polar bear.
As I recall, this arrangement underneath the canoe, there's a story attached to that, too.
Yes, this is a Komatik, an 18-foot Eskimo sled. And it's the same as a family car. Everybody has one. And it's put together with ropes and sealskin leather, and there's not a nail or a bolt in it. And it oscillates over this rough ice like the front wheels of a car when pulled by a snowmobile or dog team. And the canoe is cushioned with caribou hides from the full length of the Komatik.
So, that's how the first leg of the journey was made. I think now, from your films, our audience will see why a Komatik was necessary. This is early spring in the Arctic, the month of May. The long night of winter is broken, and the sun shines again, but with little real warmth as yet.
We flew the canoe and our supplies into Repulse Bay in late May because our journey had to begin before the ice cleared on Hudson Bay. The ice there doesn't go out until mid-August, and we would have been too late in the year coming down through Canada and the United States. Believe me, it takes a long time to cover 5,200 miles by canoe.
Repulse Bay is not much of a town by our standards, but for the Arctic, it's a thriving metropolis. There's a government building, a church, and 2 stores, one of them the Hudson's Bay Company. There's also a cemetery on a hill, where all the graves are on top of the ground. Since there's no earth, it's all granite rock. On the other hand, the snow drifts around the plywood houses, nearly covers them. The wind blows up to 90 miles per hour at times.
This is a land of ice and rock. There's no motel for tourists. We moved into the guest house provided by the Northwest Territory Administration. It was comfortable enough, but we had to do our own cooking. There is no restaurant there either. For the voyage south over the ice, we had planned to pull the canoe on a Komatek with dog teams.
David Tuktujuk, one of the few remaining owners of sled dogs, offered to haul the expedition's canoe and Komatek over the first leg of the trip to Chesterfield Inlet, 300 miles away. Two days were spent in making trial runs with the dog team.
When a dog team driver wants his dogs to move, he uses a 40-foot-long sealskin whip. And believe me, those dogs pay attention. We were quite a distance from the settlement at the end of the first day of the dog team trials. David decided to make an igloo for us. First, he tested the snow to find some that was just right. From start to finish, it took less than an hour, only using a wood saw and an old corn knife. It turned out to be quite comfortable for the 3 of us. Warmer than a tent. The wind doesn't blow through.
During the trial runs, David Tuktujuk decided that the trip was too long and that too many dogs would be needed. So snowmobile drivers were recruited for the first leg of the trip. On the day of departure, May 27th, the whole town turned out. The wives of the Eskimo guides gave their husbands a goodbye kiss. Everyone waved goodbye. The Shield canoe expedition was off, over ice 5 feet thick, heading south to open water. What's it like riding in a canoe on a Komatek?
Rough. Halfway between a Jiminy jump and a Joplin jolt.
It wasn't quite as smooth as we'd anticipated in the trial runs. The ice was full of cracks and open leads, and sometimes pressure ridges 12 feet high.
Well, you did eventually get to Chesterfield Inlet, didn't you?
Yes, 22 days later, after being marooned by the spring storms at the mouth of Wager Bay, about 150 miles south of Repulse Bay, we had to leave Little Eric and came back for it later.
We began to realize why the territorial government had said that we'd be traveling at our own risk. We spent 3 weeks bouncing back and forth between the settlements along the bay before actually getting out on the open waters of Hudson Bay.
Here, the expedition often made use of the outboard motors on Little Eric and on the safety boats. Much of the way along Hudson Bay, they were accompanied by these larger cargo canoes. In some places, small icebergs dotted the water. In other areas, progress was much slower. On Hudson Bay, in the spring, the sea ice blows into shore and out again at the whim of the local winds. The voyageurs kept a constant eye on the winds. An east wind was bad news. It would blow the ice from the bay onto shore. There were many times when Little Eric and the safety boat and supplies had to be carried over ice floes hundreds of yards wide, cutting progress to only a few miles a day. By this time of the year, the days had grown longer. These scenes were filmed at 10 o'clock in the evening. The boats were launched off the ice backwards to protect the motors and propellers. Repair shops are hundreds of miles apart along Hudson Bay. There were other times when the need for fresh food took precedence over mileage. An impromptu seal hunt usually resulted in a full larder for a few more days. The voyageurs ate the seal meat, as was the custom of the guides. Fires may be built for making tea, but not for cooking seal. After the hunt, back on the waters of Hudson Bay, pressing southward. By July 6th, 40 days after starting out, the expedition had traveled almost 1,000 miles to the 60th parallel and found themselves marooned again, this time by the tides of Hudson Bay.
The tides in this area go in and out almost 5 miles. So it's possible to land on the shore and then 6 hours later be a long ways from the water. We stayed here 36 hours waiting for good weather. We set up housekeeping, repaired the canoe, admired the thousands of ducks and geese, including this little gosling. The tides are just like buses. If you don't catch the first one, another will come along later. At last, our timing matched that of the tide, and we set out again, heading for Churchill.
It was below Eskimo Point that we almost literally stumbled over one of our prized treasures of this trip. This is an old muzzle-loader Hudson Bay gun that shoots a lead ball, and we found it quite near where we beached our boat.
It must have been out there a long time to have gathered that much moss.
As far as we know, it dates back to about 1880.
The problem of space prevented us from bringing back a lot of other interesting items as well.
Well, I see you found room for these.
We made room for them. This wall hanging must have taken months to complete. The characters all tell the story of the Hudson Bay Eskimos. And each one of the characters are made from seal skin with ivory-carved faces.
What about the sculpture?
This is an Arctic char fish made from one huge whalebone with the caribou horns as a stand. And one can only guess how long it might have taken this Eskimo to make this beautiful carving.
We even picked up these Voyager hats, a style that's been known in the area for a long time.
The year 1970 was a historical year for the Hudson Bay Company. 1670 to 1970. And they don't say 300 years old, they say 300 years bold.
Very stylish, I think. Now, tell me, at this point, were you still in Eskimo country?
We were just starting to move out